Seats. So I just want to give an introduction to our speaker this morning. I've not known Chris that long. Chris Clifton-Brown, originally from Newcastle.
Aye.
Aye. And his dad led the church, a plant in Edinburgh, is that right? He moved to Edinburgh, your dad? So he's been around New Frontiers for a long time. Chris moved to Liverpool, you're going to tell us this, aren't you? A few years back, planted a church in Liverpool, which is growing. It's called Freedom Liverpool. He's a really encouraging guy, very, very prophetic. Was in Leeds for a long time as an elder in the church there, and it's a real blessing to the church and a real blessing to have him with us. He rang me, let's just tell you this story. I was having a really bad day, and it was the day I dropped my phone down the toilet. And the only phone call I got that day, because the phone wasn't working properly, was from Chris. And Chris rang me via Facebook, and we had a really good chat. It was like November when it was really bad. It was just really miserable. Wasn't reading my Bible. Anyway, so Chris really encouraged me. And after he rang off, the phone died and wouldn't work again. And it was an amazing provision for him. So let's give Chris a welcome. We want to pull the best out of our preachers, don't we? So let's give him a warm welcome.
Great, thank you. Just going to put that there a sec. So as Dave said, I grew up in Newcastle. Actually, it was great. There's a lady, Yvonne, used to be at Newcastle Church. She remembers me. As soon as I heard, oh, Yvonne's here, I thought, oh no. All she remembers is this really rebellious youth that I was, and a nightmare for my parents. So I have changed by the grace of God. Thank God. But no, listen, we moved to Liverpool 5 years ago to plant a church. There were 7 of us who came from Leeds there. And by the grace of God, we have really been blessed in Liverpool. We're meeting, if you know this area, the 5 Ways Roundabout in Liverpool. We were from Leeds. And, you know, we are right at the point now where we've outgrown our building and we're now looking at a multi-site where God's just been mega faithful and we are bursting at the seams and just going, what's next for us? So it's a real blessing. We've had Dave over, actually, to speak. He was a blessing to us as a church. And I also wanted to just say we camped with you guys at New Day. And that was a massive, massive blessing. And I came away from there looking at the attitude of your church, just the way that you served. Danielle was amazing. Everybody served. And Matt, I mean, honestly, he made me tired watching how hard he worked. And I just thought, this is amazing. Even the youth, I know you're sitting in here, you all did amazingly well. Well-behaved, and I was just so impressed by actually the culture that's been set in the church, one that serves hard, one that knows actually we're here to serve. They were here to serve the youth so that they could enjoy being with God and experiencing Him. And we were just so blessed, weren't we, as a couple as we came. We thought, actually, this is the culture we want our youth work to have and to be set. So it was great to be amongst you. A real blessing. I wanted to start today. It's one of those things that we're hitting spring, and we start to think you're getting all these things through your emails about gym membership and this discount and come and join up. And I thought we'd start this morning with a bit of exercise and a bit of an incentive as well. So I wanted to find out who's fit here this morning. No one's actually going for that. Matt, I know you're definitely fit because I've seen you. We've got another guy at the back there. Yeah? Who's going to be the fittest? Who's the fittest? Matt? Matt, I've got an incentive for you here. This might change a lot of your minds now. Do you want to earn a tenner this morning? Come on up. Let's give him a round of applause. Can you do do you know what the burpees is? Do that, feet back, and then do a star jump, something like that. Right. And what we need him to do, I don't know if we can put this on the counter. Can we put 3 minutes? 3 minutes. You got to do this for.
Road relay races afternoon.
Right. Well, you're not going to be running that road relay race. 3 minutes. Anyone give me a timer? Dave, you got a timer there? It's worth this. What do you think?
I'll give it a go.
Come on, everyone. Let's give him a cheer on. Off you go. Ready? You've got to keep going for 3 minutes. He's getting serious now. He's taking his phone out of his pocket.
Hang on, I've done 3 hours.
3 hours? Yeah. It's going to be a long preach this morning.
Okay, we're ready.
We're ready?
Go.
Go. That's the one. He's got to do this for 3 minutes. All right, let's cheer him on. Let's cheer him on. Come on, Matt. Who else thinks they can do this? There's a tenner in it for you. Any of the youth who are thinking, do you know what? Come on. Who's this? This is Alan. Okay. Come on up. All 3 seconds. You've got to keep it going, though. Yeah? Off you go. In fact, we're not quite the 2-minute mark. It's all right. It's all right. We'll keep it going. Come on. This is what you do most mornings, isn't it? Anybody else want to have a crack at this? Come on. One of those youth have got to be thinking, this is worth a tenner. You've got to keep going. Got to keep going. Come on. You going to have a go? Shall we ask Dave to do this? Dave, come on. Come on. You can't say no now. I just like embarrassing church leaders. You know, this is what we do. Off they go. Let's keep clapping them. Come on, guys. You can do this. You've got 55 seconds to go. 55. Keep it going. Keep it going. Come on, Matt. You're doing brilliantly. Come on. You got to keep it going. You got to keep it going. Come on. Come on. Come on. 30 seconds. Come on. Oh. Dave's phone had broken and now it's really broken. Yeah. Come on. 18. Let's count them down. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Listen, that was brilliant. Well done, guys. Dave. There you are. Now listen, guys, you can choose to spend these on cakes now. I think you've earned it. Yeah? Well done. Well done, Matt. It's great. I'd love to tell you that has something to do with the preach, but no, it does. You will find out. But this morning, I was speaking today about what you've been speaking on, and he's told me that he's been going through some of the foundations. And so I wanted to, again, I know he's been looking at parables. I wanted to look at a parable this morning that helps us to understand the foundation of grace. Okay? And before we get into that, I thought it's really important. I don't know if you can actually read that with a light on it. It's really important to understand some terminology before we get into this, to understand where we're going with it. So some helpful terminology that you will hear, biblical terminology. One is justice. This word justice in the Bible, its definition is getting what you deserve. Mercy is not getting what you deserve, and grace is getting what you don't deserve. It's getting what you don't deserve. And you know, if we look back in New Testament days, we want to understand what did the disciples, what did the Jewish nation, what did the Romans understand by this word grace at the time? And actually, the Greek word for grace was originally a military term that was used. So when an emperor came to the throne and they celebrated their birthday, then he would give all of his troops a donation, a donatarium, or a charisma, a grace gift of money. And the reality is this wasn't something that they'd earned. It wasn't their wages. It wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a well done, guys. This was given out of the goodness of the emperor's heart, simply because it was his birthday, okay? It was a grace gift. And so when we're talking about grace, actually, this is what they would have understood. They would have understood that the emperors gave a grace gift on his birthday, something unearned, something undeserved. And when we look in the Bible and we look at grace, a lot of what we see around this word is Pauline theology. It's things that have come from books or epistles that the Apostle Paul has written. But I want to ask you, what does Jesus say about grace in the Bible? Can anyone tell me how many times he talks about grace? Anyone know? How many times does he mention the word grace? 62? No. He doesn't mention the word grace once in the whole of the New Testament, in the Gospels, which is interesting. But he does teach about grace. And I wonder, where are some of the examples about where he might teach about this concept, this understanding of grace? Anyone tell me? Sorry, I like to get a little bit interactive, so shout out.
On the cross with the thief, and he said, "You'll see me in paradise."
On the cross, on the thief is a great example of the grace of God. Yeah. His own life. Do we know any parables where he might be teaching about this concept of grace? The parable of the talents? Yeah. Anything else? The prodigal son is a classic example. What was that one? It is. You know which one? Laborers in the vineyards. Yes, absolutely, it was. There's also the Great Supper. So it's really helpful to understand Jesus' Pauline theology has come from understanding what Jesus has taught us in stories, in parables. Okay? And some helpful quotes about grace. Gordon MacDonald, he's a theologian, he says this. He says, "The world can do almost anything as well as or better than the church." He said, "You need not be a Christian to build houses, feed the hungry, or heal the sick. There is only one thing that the world cannot do. It cannot offer grace." And you know, Gordon MacDonald's put his finger on why this is such an important topic for us as the church, as the bride of Christ. Because this is the only thing that we can offer that no one else can offer. Okay? Everything else, all the charitable things that we do that are great, all the social action, social enterprise projects that are great, that we want to encourage, but the world also can do and can often do a lot better than we can. Ravi Zacharias, who is an apologist, he argues that the only thing that separates Christianity from all other religions is grace. He says this: "The fact that sin is present in Christianity is not unique. The fact that sin needs to be punished is not unique. But the fact that God himself would take on the punishment for others is totally unique to Christianity. And that he would give us all the inheritances and riches that his son deserves. That is pure grace." Do you know, many of you know, we've grown up in New Frontiers. You are a New Frontiers church. And Terry Virgo was the guy who started this movement. And he preaches on grace regularly. Actually, one of the things New Frontiers values is it's a foundation of grace that we live on. And I want to encourage you just on a few books. He's written a book called God's Lavish Grace. It's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, read it. And Terry, when he preaches, he typically preaches from Pauline theology, from Romans 5, 6, 7, and 8. I also want to encourage you to read a few other books. Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace. If you haven't read this book, this is like in my top 10 of all books. It's a book which is superb, which helps us to understand grace. And do you know, he starts the book, Philip Yancey starts this book explaining that the difficulty of writing a book on the grace of God is that as we try and explain it and define it, we're in danger of destroying it. We're in danger of actually putting rules or set regulations on what it looks like. And so actually his book on What's So Amazing About Grace is a whole load of stories that help us to see glimpses and glimmers of grace, of how it's used, of how God's grace comes to us. And actually, what's very interesting is that's exactly how Jesus taught on grace, through stories, through helping us to understand, where's the grace in this story? What are the things to look out for that help us to see maybe we're not living in the grace that he's brought us? So today we're going to turn to Matthew 20, if you've got your Bibles. And we're looking at this parable of the laborers in the vineyards. So, about 9 a.m, he went out and saw others. Sorry, that's not the way it starts. For the kingdom of God is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyards. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyards. About 9 a.m, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And he told them, "You also go and work in my vineyards, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon, and at about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing at about 5 in the afternoon. He went out, and he found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?" "Well, because no one's hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyards." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Do you know, we, at the beginning of the church plant, we did exactly the same as Dave is doing now, coming back to laying foundations in the church, really important foundations. And so as Freedom Church, we taught again on lots of the foundations of the faith, and we taught on grace. And actually, this needs to be something that is in the very culture of the church. And culture is a word that you may hear a lot. And actually, it's referring to a soil. When you have rich soil that has had many years of work and planting happening within it, then the soil gets a good, healthy culture to it. So, essentially, whatever you plant in that soil will reap a harvest because it has a rich culture to it. And as the church, we need to keep practicing and understanding this culture of grace and keep looking at it and saying, what's in this? How rich is this culture in our church? If this is a thing that we get to offer to the world that nobody else does, then we need to make sure that there's a culture of grace within the church. And looking at this parable, I just want to pick up on some things that are going to help us to understand little glimpses of grace. So we'll start with the title. Okay, the title is The Parable of the Workers in the Vineyards. And just to say before I start, where is it? It's here. I've recommended one book this morning. I wanted to recommend this other one here. It's called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. It is quite academic, but I have to be honest again, it's probably in my top 5 books of all time. And it's a guy called Kenneth Bailey, who's a scholar in Middle Eastern culture. So he's just helping us to understand, actually, to be honest, we've often misinterpreted parables and culture. And so he just helps us to go, listen, what was actually going on in that day? It's an excellent book, an excellent read. And so I'll be quoting him a little bit today as we look at this parable. So he says about this parable, he talks about the title, and it's a little bit, he says the title is a little bit misinterpreted, okay? Just like the prodigal son in the title there, for some reason in the West, we put the emphasis on the son. And actually in the Middle East, the shocking thing about this story would have been the father, okay? And so it's almost like he's saying the title's incorrect. We've called it, the prodigal son, and it should be actually the amazing, compassionate, gracious father, okay? Because that's the thing that would have stood out to those guys in that day. And the same is here, actually. This parable has been titled with the focus of the laborers. And yet, actually, it's the vineyard owner who brings the shocking revelations in this parable. And someone suggested it maybe, or should have been called, the amazing compassion and grace of the employer. So just thinking about that is helpful as we start this parable. From Middle Eastern eyes, the shocking thing in this parable is the vineyard owner, okay? So firstly, on grace, I want to say this. Grace comes to us when we are hopeless, when we're helpless, when we're lost and powerless. And that's for all of us, okay? One of the key points in this parable is that everybody in this parable started off helpless. They were all rescued by the kindness of this vineyard master. And what would happen in that day, it was common practice. You would have men who needed to provide for their families. And they would go around harvest time, they would stand in the square, the local square. And this was where employers would go and pick up workers for the fields. And so they would leave their house at 6 in the morning because work started at 6 in the morning. And they would go and stand in this square waiting. And employers would turn up and they'd go, yes, I'll have you, I'll have you, I'll have you. And the reality is, these men, there was no benefits in those days. If you didn't work, you couldn't afford to provide for your family. You couldn't afford to provide for yourself, okay? Actually, it still happens today in some cultures. It's still the same way. People are picked up and taken to, in agricultural sectors, they're taken to work in the fields. And without this employment, actually, they are in a very desperate state, okay? All it takes is a few weeks of no employment, and your family is starving. And you have no food left. And so it's really important to understand what state these workers were in when they started the day. If they didn't get work, it wasn't long before they were in real trouble. And we see in this parable that the vineyard owner goes out 5 times at different points in the day, and he picks up workers after workers after workers, okay? Until the last worker comes at 5 o'clock in the evening, of which work finishes at 6. It was a 6 till 6 day, okay? And I don't know if you've ever felt helpless or powerless in situations in your life. It might be that, just like these guys, you've struggled to provide for yourself or for your families. It might be that you felt helpless to change a situation at work or a relationship that's broken down. But for me, in my life, I remember a time where I felt pretty helpless and powerless, and it was about 10 years ago. And I have a health condition called aplastic anemia, which is a bit like leukemia, but there's no cancer. But I had chemotherapy 10 years ago. And it was 3 weeks in hospital of very intense chemotherapy. And before I went in to have this chemo, I was an elder in the church. I was a salesman in a good job. And life felt pretty good. And when I came out of hospital 3 weeks later, having not eaten a lot, I was pretty helpless, actually. Even walking to the car park from my hospital bed, I had to stop twice on the way to the car. And I remember getting home and trying to walk up the flight of stairs, and I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without stopping and taking a rest. And I went from being able to do a lot to not being able to do anything. If you ask my wife, she will tell you I literally couldn't do anything. I could sit in my bed and I could read, and that was all I could do. And that was for quite a few months until my body started to recover from the effects of the intense chemotherapy that I had. And I felt pretty helpless. But I want to say even this doesn't paint a real picture of how truly helpless the Bible tells us that we are. Okay? The Bible tells us that since Adam and Eve chose to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that all of us are now spiritually dead in our sins. And the problem with being dead is that you cannot do anything. You have no ability to see or hear or do anything. You're helpless. You're actually in total darkness. And the thing about dead people is they need somebody else to step in. They need a life giver. And so the only way that something can change in this situation when somebody is dead is someone comes along and saves them. And that's what we're told that God has done for you and I. He saw that we needed saving. We needed a rescuer because we were totally and utterly unable to satisfy the requirements of the law and to change our own selfish nature. So Christ came to each of us and he rescued us out of this dead state that we're in. And it says he's made us alive. He's made us a new creation. He's given us a new heart that actually wants to choose him, that wants to listen and obey him, that wants to please him. And it says he's come and he's made his dwelling amongst us, in us. He's living in you and I. That's the amazing state of what God has done for us. And we see in this parable, by the way that the guys react later, we see that some of them have forgotten the kindness that they've originally been shown by this landowner. They've forgotten how helpless they have been. They've forgotten about the desperate state they'd been in as they were hoping for work to provide. And actually, some of them have not only just forgotten, by the end of this parable, we see they feel like they deserve something. And they deserve something more than they're being given. Romans 5, verse 6 says, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." I want to say this about grace. It only makes sense when we realize how hopeless and lost and doomed that we actually were or are. In fact, if we forget where we've come from, this dead state, total darkness, then we lose all the joy and the power that grace brings. It only makes sense when we realize that we have done nothing, okay? It was the landowner in this parable who came to the workers, and it's God who comes to you and I. He's the one who first loved us, and he's the one that's made a way for us to know him. So to understand grace, we must remember how desperate our state is without God. Okay, that's the first point. Second point, grace makes us all equal with one another. If you see verses 11 and 12 in Matthew 20, it reads this. It says, "When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day.'" This phrase that they use, "you've made them equal to us," is a really important phrase. And if that's a phrase that starts to hit our realities, if we start to think that in our heads and in our hearts, then I want to suggest we actually don't understand grace. You see, if we start seeing fellow human beings as always people that we're in competition with, that they're rivals, that we want to be better and we want to do better and we want to have more than other people, then I want to suggest something's not right in our understanding of grace. Grace makes us absolutely equal before God. Equal in the fact that none of us have earned any favor or deserve any more than we've received. Equal in that God lavishes the same generosity and compassion to each and every one of us. You know, Jesus, when you look at his ministry and you look at the people that he chose to spend time with, okay, actually there are people in our society that, if we're totally honest, we all might look down on. We somehow think that we're better than them. But these are the very people that Jesus chose to spend time with. So when we think about it, a Samaritan social outcast, a hated tax collector, Simon the leper. And I think if Jesus was in Liverpool, he might even hung out with Everton fans. I don't know. I'm a Reds, by the way. But you know, in contrast, Jesus got a really chilly reception from the respectable types, the religious leaders, the pious Pharisees who thought it was uncouth and unworldly. You know, a rich young ruler, I know Dave spoke on him last week, who walked away from him shaking his head. And even the open-minded Nicodemus, who sought a meeting with him under the cover of darkness. Do you know, back in those days, the society was essentially a religious caste system, okay? So when it came to looking down on others, it was very easy in that society to know your place. But I want to say when Jesus came and he brought his kingdom, he seemed to turn this system on its head, okay? So the very people that you weren't supposed to hang out with who made you unclean, Jesus touched and made clean. He was socializing with children and Samaritans who were seen as half-breeds and prostitutes. And all of these people would have been at the bottom of this caste system. And in Palestine, stern laws enforced this stigma of a caste system. And they enforced it when it came to people who were ill, those who had diseases like leprosy, the unclean. Because if you had leprosy in those days, you had to live outside of the city walls, okay? And if you wanted to come in through the gates of the city, you had to shout, "Unclean! Unclean!" So that people knew to get out. They knew to move before they approached anyone. And you know, when we look at our society, when we look at our culture, I think, you know, there's lots of good things. We may have tried to give equal rights in our society. And I don't think there's a clear caste system. But I think there are still the same problems of superiority. And maybe this is going to occur between those who are employed and those who are unemployed. Maybe those who own houses and those who rent houses. Those who have cars and those who travel on public transport. Maybe those who can't afford the right fashion and those who can't. Maybe it's those who have the perfect figure and those who do not. Maybe it comes down to those who are married or got a partner or those who do not. And in the church, it might be some of these things. But it also might be that your role within the church is a public one and somebody else's is not. It's an upfront role and somebody else's is not. They're not seen. It may be that somebody leads an area or service in the church that they start to feel like actually they're better than somebody else, that they deserve more than someone else. It may even be, if we look at this parable, that somebody's been a Christian for 50 years and somebody else has been a Christian for 5 years. And if you've been a Christian for 50 years, maybe you can start to look down on the person that's just come to Christ. And it can even be the other way around when it comes to class or privilege. It can be that actually we look down on those who are privileged in our society. They've had maybe more opportunities in their background, and you can start to look down on them because of the privileges they've received. But Romans 3 says this, 22 to 24 says, there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. I want to say this about grace. Every time that we think that we're better than someone else or more important, I want to suggest that we haven't understood the gospel of grace. The parable of the workers here, they think they are better than the other workers who've arrived later on, because they've been working in the full heat of the day, working hard. Every time we feel like we're better or deserve more than somebody else, we've misunderstood grace. Every time we think that we can boast because we've done something to earn favor with God, or we're pretty good really because we've worked really hard in this area of church ministry. Do you know, I think we can be pretty proud of ourselves. And when we start to fall into that trap of thinking, do you know what, I think God owes me a few favors in this one. I've been praying constantly for the last 4 months, and I think God owes me for that. If that becomes our mindset and our mentality, I want to suggest we haven't fully understood the grace of God. The parable of the workers, they think they deserve more than the other workers because they've worked longer. They think they can actually earn some kind of leverage over God and others. I want to say grace removes all boasting and breaks down all barriers that might be there. Because the reality is there's nothing we have done. There is nothing we can boast in. There is nothing about which we can stand in judgment on others about. The only thing we actually bring to the relationship with God is our sin. It's the only thing that we bring. Colossians 3:11 says, here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. This is what grace looks like. God sees no difference in his church. All of his church are beautiful and precious to the point that he has given everything. He's laid down his life for each and every one of you. Thirdly then, grace is never unfair. It always operates righteously. Is that the next slide? Yeah. I don't know if you can see the picture there, but it's a picture of Kevin, from Kevin and Perry. If you're younger, you may not understand who these guys are, but this was a comedy that was showing, and they were a bunch of teenagers, and they constantly talked about how everything was just so unfair, everything that they did. And you know, I think as a parent, this could be a very real, true story, isn't it? Actually, I think as parents, we're constantly managing this thing of life is unfair. And we're constantly going about trying to create the least amount of arguments as possible. So if one child has had this amount of screen time, the other child has to have the same amount of screen time. My wife's shaking her head there. No, it's not how it works. Not in our house. You know, you've given 3 sweets to one, and the other child must have 3 sweets. Bedtimes. That child had 10 minutes extra to their bedtime. I want 10 minutes extra to my bedtime. And as a parent, this is often what we're dealing with, of trying to make life as fair as possible so that our kids don't fall out and start going about how unfair life is. And I want to say this. Firstly, grace is never unfair. If you look at verse 13, Jesus talks about it not being unfair. I think just thinking about this story, the strange thing in this story is that the landowner, I don't know if you've noticed this, the landowner chooses to pay the worker who was there last, the one who's worked an hour, he chose to pay them first. And It's a deliberate action. Have you noticed that? And as parents, we would never choose to do that. I think honestly in the world, we would never choose to do that. Actually, if we wanted to pay somebody equal, I would have bought those guys who were in first, gave them their denarius, sent them on their way, and paid the other people a denarius. That's how we would have made it work. But Jesus wanted to show us something deliberate here, because it provokes a reaction in us, doesn't it? It provokes that reaction of, that's not fair. If we're honest, and we look at this story, Matt did 3 minutes, and Dave did about 10 seconds. No, you didn't. You did a minute. But actually, they both received the same. And God wanted to make this a deliberate action. He says, but he answered one of them, friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. Kenneth Bailey in the book says this. He says, equal pay for equal work is a centuries-old understanding of justice. But that is not the issue here. This parable presents the overpaid, not the underpaid. He says the story focuses on an equation filled with amazing grace, which is present by those who feel that they have earned their way to more. The whole issue with this parable is nobody in this parable is underpaid. The cry of not fair is the complaint from those who have justly been paid. And it's those who cannot tolerate the grace shown to others. That's what's happening here. You've made them equal to us, they shout angrily. This reminds us of the prodigal son. Do you remember when the son comes home and the father says, look, here's a ring, here's a robe, let's have a feast. And the elder son is so angry at the way that his brother has been treated that he can't even enter into the celebrations. He is so angry that his father has shown him this grace and compassion. In this parable, we get to understand that grace is never unfair. God will never be less than fair. But he actually reserves the right, as he says in this parable, to be more than fair, according to his pleasures and riches of his grace. And you know, we see in this parable the landowner show an amazing, genuine concern for these men's welfare. We see a generous, merciful, compassionate landowner. And grace will often, honestly, feel unfair to us because our whole society, our whole culture teaches us that you get what you pay for. From reception class upwards, even as parents when you're teaching toddlers, it's good behavior equals treats. You do this and you deserve this. But that is not the message of grace. That goes against the whole message of grace. So I want to ask, how might that manifest in our own lives? And just thinking about that, I think if we start comparing ourselves to others and the jobs that they have, or the money they have, the family they have, the friendships they have, and we start to feel angry or upset, maybe at the opportunities that they've received, they're not the same as ours, then I want to suggest that there might be something in our spirits that's lacking in the grace of God. Jealousy. If we start to feel jealous towards others, I want to suggest that actually there's a problem with our understanding of grace. If someone has been promoted above us, obviously if you see church life as a promotion, then I want to suggest you've misunderstood. It's a role, not a promotion. But maybe somebody's got a role in church that you thought you were going to get. And you're upset. You feel like you deserve that. We need to keep coming back to looking at the very grace of God. Finally, final point, I want to say grace costs the master. Did you notice in verse 8 that halfway through the story, a foreman appears in this story? And he's to call the workers in so that they can get paid. And it's interesting here because actually if we understood that there was a foreman in this story, in those days, the owner of the vineyard, if you had a foreman, he was the one doing the hard work for you. That's what he was employed to do all day long. And he would have been the one going into the marketplace to collect the workers, the laborers. And you'd give them the instructions at the beginning of the day, and you'd ask them to report back at the end of the day. And as the owner of the vineyard, you'd be sitting back, watching some TV, whatever you do, enjoying your life because you own the workers. So I want to ask the question, what's going on here? Why have they made it so, and this would have stood out in Middle Eastern culture, that it was the owner, the land owner, who was going to the marketplace. Why is it that the landowner has made the trek to the marketplace 5 times during the day, in the heat of the day? Because he didn't need to. But the parable is very deliberate on making sure that we understand it is the landowner. And the thing is, we need to understand, who is this landowner? He's God. That's who he plays in this parable. It's God. And Kenneth Bailey says this. He says, he does not remain aloof. His compassion leads him to go to the hurting himself and thereby incarnate his deep concern as he demonstrates costly love to the poor. God isn't aloof, okay? Jesus came to earth. He came and dwelt amongst us. He's not distant. He's not far off. He dwells in us now. And God makes that journey to make sure that we feel welcome. But I want to say this about grace. It may be free, but it's never cheap. It always costs. And I want to say it always costs God. Someone does pay. Have you noticed this? The generous employer, he decided to take on himself the cost of not having those people work all day. He absorbs the cost of that. Okay? There is a cost. I run a business as well as lead the church in Liverpool. And I have to be honest, when I read this parable and I see what the landowner's done, if I ran my business in this way, I'd be bankrupt. Absolutely bankrupt. It would be absolute madness in the business world to do what this landowner has done. But that is the absolute point here. The point is that God chose to take on the cost. He sent his one and only Son. He gave up everything for you and I so that we could receive him, all of the riches of heaven. So I want to end just by concluding, just wrapping up what we've seen here this morning. This is a parable that helps us to see the amazing grace of God. He's rescued us when we were helpless and hopeless. And we have nothing in us, in and of ourselves, to give to him. He came to us not because we deserved anything, not because he felt sorry for us, but because he loves us. He treated every single one of us the same, no matter what your backstory is here this morning. Got mentioned the thief on the cross. He'd done absolutely nothing, and Jesus says, you will see me in paradise. He'd put his trust in Jesus. And he's not only forgiving us, but he has given us, he's lavished his gifts upon us. He has given us a place in eternity forever with him. And it's cost him everything. It's cost him his life. The excruciating pain that he's been through, separation from the Father for the first time in all history. But I want to say this about grace. This is what we as the church get to bring to our communities, to our neighborhoods, to our streets, to our schools, to our workplaces, the grace of God. And I want to encourage you all to live in it and practice it daily.
The band would like to come back up. Good response that we worship. I think it would be amiss of us